What if I told you? The flood did not end the age of giants. It only drove them deeper, beneath the mountains, beneath the deserts, beneath the cities we've built. Brick by blind brick, they wait. The Nephilim, sons of angels, cursed by heaven. Their bodies too vast for daylight, their sins too loud for the winds to carry. They did not drown. They vanished, and where they vanished, tunnels split the earth like veins. Their kingdom didn't fall, it sank. Vaulted halls now echo in silence. Carvings made by hands not human still glow with forbidden light. And below the ruins of time, their voices are not gone, they whisper. This is the story of that silence, of what went below and never came back up, of a forgotten bloodline that waits in the dark, for the world above to forget, so they can rise again. So stay with me until the very end, because once you see what survived the wrath of heaven, you'll question who's really ruling from the shadows, and if you're new here, tap that subscribe button, and tell me in the comments below, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now close your eyes and return with me, to a world beneath the flood, to the underground kingdom, where the giants still breathe. There is a mountain that men have feared to climb, not because of beasts, nor cold, nor height, but because of silence. Mount Ararat stands alone on the high plains of eastern Anatolia, rising so suddenly that it appears not carved by time, but placed by a giant's hand. Its snows do not melt, its winds do not speak, and its roots, some say, do not end. For generations, shepherds refused to graze too near its base. Their flocks trembled at the footpaths that disappeared into stone. Children whispered of lights beneath the surface, as if the mountain breathed. And though explorers came again and again to claim that Noah's Ark had come to rest here, there was something they always ignored. The stories of what lay under Ararat, not above it. It began with strange fissures that opened near the village of Koran in the early 1800s. Locals said the earth had yawned, as if waking from a long dream. From these cracks came gusts of warm, stale air that carried with it a smell older than rot. One villager claimed he lowered a lamp into the darkness, only for the flame to vanish, not extinguish, but disappear, as if consumed. Others said they heard groaning below. A priest declared it was the voice of the old Nephilim, still buried but not dead. He was ignored, until the tunnels were found. In 1829, a travelling cartographer named Hans Euler from Prussia arrived to map the strange terrain surrounding Ararat's base. He noticed that the terrain dipped unnaturally in a semicircle pattern along one ridge, like a ring had been pressed into soft ground and fossilised. Euler suspected some kind of ancient ruin, possibly volcanic. With a small team and local guides, he began digging near the Central Depression. What they found was neither ruin nor cave, it was architecture. A black stone staircase led downward at a perfect 32-degree angle. Each step was polished and etched with what looked like parallel grooves, perhaps for draining water or blood. By the 5th day of excavation, the workers had descended more than 40 feet. That was when they stopped, not because the descent ended, but because they heard voices. The foreman claimed they weren't echoes, and they weren't local. He described them as chanting, deep, rhythmic, pulsing like the mountain's own heartbeat. One of the guides, an elderly Kurdish woman named Safiye, fell to her knees and began to weep. She begged them to stop. Her family, she said, had once told of giants who were cast underground in chains of sleep. "Don't wake them," she whispered. "They dream of the surface." Ulla dismissed her words as superstition, but his journal entry from that night took a strange turn. "I am not well," he wrote. "The stone hums. My teeth ache. My ears ring with thoughts that are not my own." He continued for 2 more pages, but the handwriting became erratic, slanted, as if written by a shaking hand. The expedition ended abruptly 2 days later. Ulla's team packed up, filled in the opening, and left without explanation. He never published his findings, but the story didn't end there. In 1911, Russian military engineers scouting the region during the Ottoman collapse uncovered an abandoned pit covered by large basalt slabs. They removed the stones and found the same 32-degree staircase. At the base, however, something new had emerged. The staircase now led to a vast circular chamber. No drawings were ever officially released, but one soldier later described the walls as lined with teeth. Not human teeth, but something too large, too smooth, too alien. Some of the men refused to enter. One, a lieutenant named Grigor Ananyan, claimed the floor was covered in dust that clung to skin like magnetized ash. What they also found, according to an unverified report housed in the Tiflis military archives, was a map. Not carved, not painted, but embedded into the stone floor itself. It depicted the mountain, yes, but with veins, arteries, tunnels that extended downward and outward, beneath the plains, beneath rivers, beneath what would later become the borders of Iran, Armenia and eastern Turkey. Each passage was marked with a symbol. Some resembled eyes, others spiral-like chains. One symbol appeared more than all the others, a hand reaching down, not up. After the Russian Revolution, the site was sealed. Officially, the chamber never existed. Unofficially, whispers began to spread through scientific and archaeological circles. In the 1930s, Soviet geologist Andrei Morozov was given limited access to the Ararat region. Though publicly he published reports on glacial erosion, his private letters, only recently declassified, tell a different story. He wrote of discovering echo chambers beneath the crust of the mountain. He used seismographs not to measure earthquakes, but to record what he called resonant signatures. These signatures, he claimed, were rhythmic, repeating, as if something below was stirring, slowly. Morozov died under suspicious circumstances in 1942. His final report ended mid-sentence. It read, "They never died. They were, and then nothing. No period. Just a smear of ink." In the decades that followed, rumours only deepened. Western expeditions to Ararat focused on the supposed arc at higher altitudes, but locals continued to avoid the lower ridges. Earthquakes struck the region regularly, but many residents noted something odd. Each quake was preceded not by rumbling, but by silence. An unnatural stillness in the air, as if the mountain was pausing to listen. In 1976, a group of Iranian spelunkers attempted to descend into a known sinkhole on Ararat's southern slope. Only 2 returned. They were pale, silent, and refused to speak of what they saw. One was committed to a psychiatric institution weeks later. The other vanished entirely. So what lies beneath Ararat? Is it just fault lines and volcanic memory? Or did something else once move beneath the earth, and now simply waits? Some geologists point to deep lava tubes and tectonic oddities as explanation. But others, those who read the journals of Ulla, the whispers of Safiye and the unfinished report of Morozov, see something older, not metaphor, not myth, but presence. You might ask, if the giants of old were cast down, as so many traditions say, where would they go? Would they fade into dust? Or would they find shelter in the deep belly of the earth, lulled into a slumber not by peace, but by judgment? And if the mountain was their prison, then who built the locks? And more importantly, what happens when those locks begin to rust? You wouldn't know it by looking at the silent slopes of Ararat today. The snow falls as it always has, untouched by politics or prophecy, and the winds carry no trace of what sleeps beneath. But silence is not the absence of sound. Sometimes it is the aftermath of a sound too ancient to remember, and beneath that silence, in the memory of stones, lay tunnels still mapped by a man who died before he could finish his sentence. It was decades after Morozov's disappearance when the echoes of his final report resurfaced, this time in the form of a steel box discovered in a warehouse near Yerevan. No one had opened it since 1943. Inside were weathered pages, samples of rock with unnatural luster, and one roll of thin tracing paper marked with precise curling lines. It was a floor plan, not of a structure, but of something deeper. Some believed it to be a guide, a route through the subterranean passageways carved not by men, but for something else. One section was labelled in Russian, Tsepnaya Palata, the Chamber of Chains. Geologists who studied the map found something more disturbing than tunnels. They found that the entire lower crust beneath Ararat seemed structured. The paths didn't follow fault lines or natural fissures. They spiralled inward toward a central chamber, like arteries feeding a sleeping heart. Every pattern was deliberate. This wasn't collapse, it was containment. In 1983, a young Armenian researcher named Lilit Sarkisian was sent to digitize these papers. She had no interest in folklore, no patience for giants or angels. Her job was to clean up Cold War clutter. But what she found in those pages consumed her. Her private notes, later published after her death, revealed a singular obsession, not with the surface world, but with the symmetries in the stone. She wrote that certain tunnels aligned with celestial movements, solstice angles, equinox echoes. One shaft in particular pointed directly towards Sirius, another toward the winter constellation of Orion. Not for light, she argued, but for resonance, and that was the key. According to her theory, the chains described by Morozov and drawn on the tracing paper were not physical at all. They were vibrational, tones, harmonic locks that kept whatever was beneath Ararat asleep, not bound by iron or stone, but by silence, a silence that had to be maintained. But the world above was growing louder. In the late 1990s, heavy mining equipment was brought into the Ararat region for unrelated construction. The government authorised digging for a hydroelectric plant near the mountain's base. The equipment struck something hard at a depth of 93 metres, not bedrock, structure, a hollow cavity. One worker claimed the sound that came from the drill was like screaming metal. Others said it wasn't the mountain that shook, but something inside it. The project was quietly cancelled. No public explanation was given. That same year, Lilith Sarkissian vanished. Her apartment was found undisturbed. Her notes gone. But the last message she sent to a colleague was simple. It's not just here. Ararat is the lid. That sentence would set off a trail of investigation, because if Ararat was only the lid, then what was the jar? Sarkissian had been corresponding with a geographer in Turkey who had uncovered similar patterns near the Taurus Mountains, over 500 kilometres to the west. These were ancient subterranean structures once believed to be burial chambers, but beneath the surface the tunnels followed a now familiar spiral design, and in their deepest chamber lay a stone wheel, 13 tons in weight, carved with the same spiral hand symbol found in Morozov's sketch. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a network. If that were true, then Ararat was not a solitary prison. It was one node in a broader lattice of locks, stretching from Anatolia to Armenia to the Zagros Mountains, even down into the marshes of Mesopotamia, where ancient Sumerian texts spoke of the Abzu, a nether ocean beneath the earth where forbidden beings slept. But what was being contained? And more disturbingly, why did ancient builders, with no access to modern engineering, go to such efforts to carve downward instead of upward? Some pointed to the Watcher myths of the Book of Enoch, where rebellious beings were cast into the earth and sealed in darkness until the end of time. Others reference older Mesopotamian epics in which the gods bound monsters in the roots of mountains. Even Islamic traditions spoke of beings locked beneath 7 earths, not dead, but restrained. Sarkissian had begun to catalogue these myths, not for religion, but for pattern recognition. The stories always agreed on one thing. What was beneath was dangerous, not simply because of its strength, but because of its knowledge. But not all knowledge stays buried. In 2004, an independent film crew attempted to document lesser-known regions of eastern Turkey. They interviewed local farmers who still spoke of forbidden wells and covered pits that goats refused to approach. One farmer told them his grandfather had once dropped a torch into a sinkhole and claimed it never hit the bottom. The flame went out, he said, but I still saw light. They followed the man to the site where an uneven stone slab lay half buried beneath moss and soil. They didn't move it, but the footage recorded that day contained an anomaly, a low-frequency vibration captured by the boom mic, rhythmic, slow, untraceable. Audio engineers later described it as being similar to mechanical breath. That documentary was never released. 2 of the filmmakers left the industry. The director, when asked about the project, simply replied, "There are stories the Earth doesn't want told." And so the question remains. If these chambers are real, if the spirals and chains were part of an ancient containment system, and if Ararat is just one lock among many, then who designed them? Could ancient humans, armed with little more than stone tools, conceive of such harmonic geometry? Or were they simply following instructions, tracing plans left behind by another intelligence? And if so, what was the cost of disobedience? There's another detail, rarely discussed. During one of Morozov's early seismograph recordings, he noted a sudden spike in subsonic activity. It lasted only 7 seconds, but it repeated every 30 years. His notes speculated that it was a breath cycle. One long inhale, one long exhale, and if it truly is breath, then whatever lies beneath Ararat is not dead, only patient. So we return to the beginning, a mountain with no summit climbers can explain, a village with air that stinks of forgotten memory, stone stairs that lead not to a tomb, but a threshold, a door, a vibration, and a silence too old to trust. But if the locks holding this thing, this knowledge, are tonal, what happens in a world of earthquakes, drilling, sonic warfare, and nuclear testing? What if the vibrations that once lulled it to sleep are now the very ones stirring it? Or perhaps the question is not when it will rise, but how deep it had to go to avoid becoming like us. The land around Ararat has always been shaped by silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the weighty kind, like a room where something just left, or something is about to arrive. In the villages scattered along the mountain's shadow, old men still spit before speaking its name, not out of disrespect, but out of caution, as if to say the name without warning might draw attention from something beneath. To them, Ararat was not just a peak, it was a cover, a lid, and lids are only necessary when something inside might escape. In the spring of 2010, a minor earthquake struck the region. It registered barely above 5.0, not unusual for the tectonic boundaries that crisscross eastern Anatolia. But what was unusual was the aftermath. Not the damage, which was minimal, not the landslides, which were few, but the humming. Dozens of local residents reported a strange low resonance that lingered in the air for nearly 48 hours. Not a sound, but a feeling, like your bones were being tuned to something unspoken. Animals refused to eat. Water in wells trembled without wind, and in the foothills near the village of Serdali, a narrow crevice opened along a forgotten trail once used by shepherds. That crevice revealed something else, a chamber carved not by erosion, but by precision. Inside were hexagonal pillars, each bearing etchings so worn they could barely be read. But the shape was unmistakable, spiral hands. In the centre of the chamber was a flat stone platform, charred black but smooth. One archaeologist, brought in under a private grant, described it as an altar without purpose, but others thought differently. One of the students assisting the excavation whispered, "It's not an altar, it's a docking point." By this point, the story had changed hands too many times to remain buried. The whispers from the Soviet era had become topics of fringe science journals, and the strange echoes beneath Ararat were attracting not archaeologists but engineers, acoustic scientists, geomagnetic surveyors. They weren't studying the mountain, they were listening to it. One group, operating out of an independent lab in Istanbul, placed a network of low-frequency sensors along Ararat's eastern face. For weeks, they picked up nothing but natural ground noise. But then, at exactly 3:33 a.m. on a moonless night in September, every sensor recorded a simultaneous signal. A pulse, 7 seconds long, identical in wavelength to the cycles once recorded by Morozov nearly 80 years prior. Only now, it wasn't 30 years apart. It was days. And so came the quiet panic. Not from governments, who still refused to acknowledge anything beneath the mountain, but from those who studied patterns, vibrations, systems. They began to wonder, had something changed? Was the containment breaking down? Or worse, was it evolving? That same year, reports emerged from central Armenia of unexplained sinkholes forming in perfect concentric circles. In one instance, a farmer claimed the sinkholes appeared overnight in his wheat field. The strange part. The ground around them was untouched. No cracks, no disturbance, just absence, like something had been lifted out. He refused to return to the land, said the field had been remembered by the deep. It was around this time that theologians, folklorists and historians began collaborating. Not out of curiosity, but necessity. Myths from entirely separate cultures were compared side by side. Sumerian, Armenian, Hebrew, Islamic, Greek. And they all shared fragments of a single buried idea. That something powerful had once been cast down, not just physically, but metaphysically. Removed from the surface not because it threatened the body, but because it infected the mind. In some texts, these beings were described as watchers fallen by pride. In others, as builders punished for revealing truths too soon. But always they were sealed alive, not executed, not exiled, sealed. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility, one that even modern science cannot fully dismiss. What if the chains beneath Ararat were never made to imprison monsters, but to silence teachers? And if that's true, then what was it they tried to teach us? Some point to the evidence of prehistoric tunnels connecting ancient sites across Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Persia. Structures so vast they would have required knowledge of mathematics, geology, and acoustics, far ahead of their time. Others note that these tunnels are often buried not by time, but by intent, sealed off with massive stone wheels, cut and forgotten as if someone feared they might one day reopen. But you can only bury knowledge for so long. In early 2022, a strange occurrence was recorded during a deep earth sonar survey by a Swiss mining company operating near Lake Van, just south of Ararat. The survey recorded an echo pattern that bounced back in geometric form, meaning the signal returned not randomly but structured, almost as if it had hit something organised. What made this significant was the altitude. The structure, or chamber or cavity, lay 12 kilometres beneath the surface, far deeper than any known archaeological depth, deeper than most of the continental crust itself. And yet the pattern repeated: circular walls, spiral geometry, harmonic return. The signal was passed off as anomaly. But one of the technicians on the team recognised something. He'd once worked with a Russian physicist who had shown him a scan, an old analogue spectrograph from the 1960s, recorded beneath Ararat. The shapes were nearly identical. That's when people began asking the real question. What if we've been misreading the mountain? What if the giants were not mythological beings, but simply the name we gave to civilizations whose size came not from stature, but from understanding? And what if those civilizations, Nephilim, Watchers, whatever term you choose, weren't destroyed at all, just disqualified from history? What if we buried not monsters, but memory? The phrase, "what lies beneath," has always implied a warning. But maybe it's the wrong question. Maybe the real question is, what did we place there? What burden did we collectively agree to forget? And now, centuries later, the Earth is shifting. Seams are opening. The tonal locks, once precise and constant, are now disrupted by the chaos of modern life. Drills, bombs, fracking, traffic, all unintentional songs, singing the wrong lullaby to a prisoner we no longer remember how to guard. And if the old resonance fades, then so does the sleep. So the story of Ararat, you see, is not just about a mountain. It is about a memory, a civilization that understood the balance of light and shadow and was punished for walking between both. The people who locked it away were not evil. They were afraid that to let it live would mean the end of their order. But in doing so, they may have built their greatest monument. Not a city, not a temple, but a delay. Because you can delay the truth, but you cannot erase it. And so we move forward. The mountain still stands, the stairs still descend, the hum still echoes, and the vibration still waits, measured, slow, patient. But now you know what lies beneath the dust. Not a tomb, not fiction, but something older than both. And the question remains, if we were the ones who lock the giants away, what happens when they finally remember who we are? Cappadocia is a land carved by wind and forgotten prayers. Its valleys bend like soft cloth folded by ancient hands, and its rock formations, those towering cones, those hollow spires, look less like accidents of erosion and more like testaments left behind by something that did not wish to be followed. The landscape is a secret whispered in volcanic ash, and beneath it lies another world, one that was never supposed to surface. For centuries, pilgrims passed through this place, drawn by the stories of early Christian monks who vanished into the earth. Not metaphorically, but literally. They descended into the stone, carving entire cities by candlelight, living, praying, hiding, and dying underground. Derinkuyu, Kaymakla, Uskonak. Names that appear on maps now, but which for most of history existed only in oral memory. Cities hidden below dust and lava stone. Cities that could house thousands. But what most travellers never ask is why those monks dug so deep, or what they found once they had gone too far. The surface history is simple. Fleeing Roman persecution during the early centuries after Christ, small Christian sects moved eastward and settled in the heart of Anatolia. The land was forgiving. Soft rock, gentle slopes, quiet winters. The monks began carving cells into the stone. First for prayer, then for living, then for hiding. But as time passed, the digging didn't stop. It went deeper. Entire churches were sculpted beneath the earth, complete with altars, frescoes, and baptistries, hidden cathedrals in silence. But the deeper they went, the stranger the architecture became. In 1963, a Turkish man renovating his home in the town of Derinkuyu knocked down a wall in his basement and discovered a passage leading to the first layer of the now famous underground city. What started as a hidden room became a labyrinth, 18 stories underground, connected by narrow shafts, sealed by stone doors that could only be moved from the inside. Archaeologists believed the city could house up to 20,000 people at once, including food storage, livestock areas, and ventilation shafts that reached the surface in perfect vertical lines. At first, it was seen as a marvel of monastic engineering, until a few researchers began to notice inconsistencies. The lowest levels bore no signs of Christian symbols, no crosses, no frescoes, no altars. Instead, they found geometric patterns etched into the walls, spirals, angular scripts, and strange indentations that seemed designed not for beauty, but for resonance. When certain tones were played, the stone vibrated, echoed, answered. That's when the deeper theories began. Some proposed that the monks had not created Derinkuyu, but had merely found it and adapted the upper layers. The lower levels, they argued, were far older, prehistoric, designed with an intention lost to time. They pointed to the air shafts which aligned with celestial events, the door mechanisms which resembled locking systems rather than mere barriers, and the passageways that seemed to lead nowhere, spiralling down, tighter and tighter, until they vanished into sealed stone. Why would monks keep digging once they had shelter? Why carve deeper when everything needed for survival was already present? And why, in some of their oldest recorded letters, did they speak of listening to the rock? One scroll, preserved in the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem, contains a cryptic line attributed to a Cappadocian elder named Father Basil in the 5th century. The stone is not dead. It remembers, it watches, and it murmurs only when it is lonely. The letter warns future brothers not to pass the 13th stair, though no map of the city officially includes such a designation. The mystery would deepen in the 1980s, when a set of illegal treasure hunters attempted to dig beneath the last known level of Derinkuyu. They disappeared. Local police investigated and discovered their gear abandoned at a newly broken section of tunnel. The opening had since collapsed, but recordings found on an old cassette tape captured something unusual. Short bursts of rhythmic tapping, too precise to be random, too slow to be mechanical. Since then, further excavation of the deepest levels has been discouraged by Turkish authorities, officially due to safety concerns. Unofficially, local guides tell stories of workers who came back pale, refusing to speak, of hearing whispers in tunnels where no one else stood, of stones that seemed warm to the touch in rooms sealed for centuries. In 1997, a French structural historian named Émile Parnell was granted special permission to survey Derinkuyu. He carried with him a set of modified instruments designed to detect micro-vibrations in subterranean materials. What he recorded, according to his private journal, was disturbing. He wrote, "The stone breathes. It does not exhale like air, but like memory. The lowest chamber hums on a tone not made by machines. It is like a sleep song, too slow to hear, but too deep to ignore." Parnell died the following year, reportedly from cardiac arrest. His instruments were returned to France. One was missing. The journal wasn't made public until his daughter, a historian herself, compiled and translated his notes. In one final entry he wrote, "The monks did not dig to hide. They were following a call. Something older was singing beneath the dust. So who, or what, had left these ancient caverns for the monks to discover? Some researchers began to draw connections between Cappadocia and Ararat. The spirals in the stone, the resonance, the whispers of breath. A pattern emerged, places beneath the surface that vibrated as if designed to restrain or contain, not to house or shelter. Could Derinkuyu have been another node in the same forgotten network described in the chambers beneath Ararat? And then came the discovery beneath Kamakla. Just 10 kilometres from Derinkuyu, this smaller but equally intricate underground city contained a chamber with carvings similar to those found in the sealed tunnels under Mount Ararat, only these were unmistakably ancient. One carving depicted a hand with 7 fingers reaching downward. Another showed a chain made of light, descending into a spiral hole. Beneath these carvings were words in an unknown script, but one phrase, partially translated from Proto-Hattic glyphs, read, "Do not wake the silent ones. Their hunger is memory." The implications were staggering. Perhaps these monks had not chosen Cappadocia randomly. Perhaps they were led there by oral traditions older than scripture. And perhaps, once they began digging, they heard something below. Something vast, not in form but in presence. They believed they were building sanctuaries, but maybe they were mapping out boundaries. And perhaps the purpose of those old stone doors, the ones only openable from the inside, wasn't to keep outsiders out, but to keep something else in. The flow from Ararat now reached deep into the valleys of Cappadocia. The same spiral geometry, the same tonal echoes, the same pattern of vanishing knowledge, and now a growing awareness. The silence beneath our feet was not passive. It was watching, waiting, breathing. So we must ask, if the monks knew what they were nearing, why didn't they stop? What did they believe lay beyond the 13th stair? And more importantly, what made them go silent? There are certain numbers that return again and again in the human record. 12 for the tribes, 7 for the heavens, 40 for exile. But 13 is different. Not sacred, not forbidden, just avoided. And in the tunnels beneath Cappadocia, it was not painted, not etched, not carved, but remembered. The monks never labelled a 13th stair, but every survivor who emerged from the deeper levels of Derinkuyu knew where it was. Not by count, but by change. It was the step where the silence thickened. The air cooled without wind. The breath caught in the lungs, not from dust, but from pores. A step that didn't descend physically, but dropped you out of the world you knew. A letter preserved in the archives of the Vatican, written in the 9th century by a Byzantine monk named Theophilos, spoke of a door that is not a door beneath the chapels of stone. He had descended with 5 others seeking solitude for Lenten fasting. On the 4th day he claimed to have heard a vibration that did not enter the ears but pulsed behind the ribs. The others felt nothing. On the 7th day 2 of them fled. One returned speechless, the other was never found. Theophilos wrote, "The rock did not move, but I swear upon the bones of Peter, it breathed in, and in that breath it tasted me." His letter ends with a warning. Do not count the stair. If you reach 13, you've already passed something you cannot return from. Centuries later, the 1963 rediscovery of Derinkuyu would bring this tale back to life. Yet even as the Turkish government mapped and lit the upper levels, there remained sealed passages untouched by archaeology. Not because they were unreachable, but because every attempt to open them ended strangely. One tunnel was discovered with a carved inscription at its entrance, not in Turkish, Greek or Latin, but in a language no linguist could fully trace. A crude translation rendered the phrase as, "Return what you heard, not what you took, not what you saw, but what you heard," as if the act of hearing something buried was itself a form of theft. In 2009, a Turkish historian named Dr. Nuray Yildirim published a quiet academic paper, almost unnoticed, titled Resonant Geometries of Early Anatolian Monastic Architecture. It described peculiar design anomalies in the lowest chambers of Cappadocia's subterranean churches, specifically that many rooms were tuned acoustically to frequencies below the range of human speech. She suggested this may have been intentional, spaces built not for the spoken word but for echoes beneath thought. She was dismissed by her peers, but in a private interview years later she confessed she had once stayed overnight in the Derinkuyu complex as part of a rare, privately funded expedition. During that night she experienced a recurring sensation, not quite a sound, not quite a dream, but a voice arriving before the words. She said it was like being remembered by something older than memory. Her last publication before retiring early contained a single cryptic footnote. If you find the 13th stair, do not answer it back. But someone did. In 2013, drone footage from an exploratory microcraft launched into one of the sealed shafts of Kaymakla revealed a chamber previously undocumented. The footage showed smooth walls, no debris, no markings, just a single raised platform and what appeared to be a spiral carved into the floor. The spiral had no beginning. It did not radiate outward. It coiled inward, impossibly beyond what the camera's frame could capture. Then, a flicker. Not of light, but distortion. The signal warped for 3 seconds. When it returned, the spiral was gone. In its place was darkness and the sound of low, rhythmic tapping, measured, deliberate, like breathing filtered through stone. The drone's feed cut out. It was never recovered. That same week, minor tremors rippled through the region. Not earthquakes, just small localized vibrations that registered on no national seismic alert. But one sensor caught it, buried in an unrelated geothermal study. The signal matched the patterns recorded under Mount Ararat in 2022. Identical, down to the duration, down to the pulse. That's when researchers began to look at the two sites not as isolated phenomena, but as chapters in the same architecture. Not just cities, but locks, interlinked, multi-chambered restraints. And perhaps what lay beneath wasn't even physical in the way we understand it. Perhaps it was thought, knowledge, consciousness older than ours, and perhaps the monks had dug not in rebellion, but in obedience. Because silence is not always avoidance. Sometimes silence is witness. One rare manuscript from the 11th century, recovered from a monastery near Kayseri, tells of a monk who heard the voice in the rock and became convinced it was not evil, but imprisoned unfairly. He believed it had been cast down not for destruction, but for warning. That its knowledge had been sealed away because humanity could not survive what it might learn. The monk began to draw strange spirals, place stones in harmonic order, chant in tones below whisper. His brothers confined him to an upper cell far from the depths. His last recorded words were, "We call it darkness, but it is not asleep." It remembers everything we buried it with. The idea took hold among fringe scholars that the monks, in those final generations before their underground sanctuaries were abandoned, had begun to listen back. That they had found beneath their feet not only silence, but response. And what they heard changed their liturgy, changed their eyes, changed their silence. Because it was not the act of digging that doomed them, it was the understanding. The 13th stair wasn't a location, it was a threshold, a moment in descent where you stopped excavating, stone, and began uncovering your own mind. The silence didn't belong to the earth, it was given to you, to see if you could carry it without speaking. So what happened to those who crossed it? Some say they vanished. Some say they emerged, changed. No longer preaching the same God, no longer fearing the same demons. They wrote fewer words, lit fewer candles, and spent their days facing downward, as if in dialogue with something no one else could see. And others never came back. Which leads us to the question no one wants to ask. Did they wake something? Or did something wake them? And if the silence is now vibrating again, across Ararat, through Derinkuyu, beneath Cappadocia's ash-choked valleys, then the real fear is not that something is coming. The real fear is that we're starting to hear it again. Cappadocia's underground sanctuaries were eventually abandoned, not by conquest, not by collapse, but by silence. No one recorded a reason. The final years of the monastic presence in those tunnels left behind no scrolls, no warnings, only extinguished lamps and empty rooms. And yet, if one listens carefully in the abandoned passageways, it becomes clear that something still lingers, not in form but in memory. The walls hold something, not dust, not echoes, but awareness. The monks may have left the tunnels, but the tunnels never stopped listening. Long after the official closure of Derinkuyu's deeper levels, small groups of researchers continued to descend unofficially, some archaeologists, others not. One of them was an acoustician from Portugal, Elias Duarte, who came not to study history but resonance. He believed that certain architectural forms could carry frequencies capable of influencing the nervous system. He had tested this theory in abandoned temples and ancient tombs around the Mediterranean. But Cappadocia was different. He had heard rumours from a Syrian stonemason who once visited the region and described a room that trembles not with sound but with presence. Duarte arrived in 2016 under the guise of an architectural historian and was granted limited access. What he discovered within Derinkuyu changed his life and ended his career. His findings, self-published in a limited paper titled "The Room That Responds," documented a chamber far beneath the main tourist paths. It contained no doors, only a slit in the stone floor, perfectly rectangular, as if meant to channel vibration. When Duarte activated a low-frequency tone generator inside the room, set at precisely 17.5 Hz, his instruments registered a return signal not from the walls, but from beneath the floor. Not a reflection, a reply. What followed was a pattern. Every 34 seconds the signal repeated, lower, deeper, shaped by design, as though something below was tuned to receive, process, and respond. He only stayed in that chamber for 22 minutes. When he emerged, he was shaking. His assistant described him as incoherent, whispering the same phrase over and over. It's not sleeping. It's remembering he never published another paper again. Since then, the theory has spread among those who study the ancient underground networks that Cappadocia, like Ararat, is not merely a place of shelter or refuge. It is part of an ancient system of communication. That the spiral geometries, the layered acoustics, the stone mechanisms were not only designed to contain, but to interact. And this raises a possibility more unnerving than any myth of giants or watchers. What if the monks were not fleeing persecution when they descended into the earth, but following instructions? Some believe they found something beneath those tunnels, not a being, not a presence, but a code, a memory embedded in stone. A kind of knowledge that could not be written with ink or spoken with language, but only felt, transmitted through resonance, imprinted on the mind like heat through the hand, and perhaps what terrified them most was how familiar it felt. There are records, fragmented, hard to verify, of a final sect of monks who lived beneath the earth until the 11th century. They are never named directly, but in one Byzantine letter preserved in the monastery of St. Catherine on Sinai, a passing pilgrim references those in Cappadocia who no longer face east in prayer, but downward. He describes their chants as toneless, their eyes as filled with absence, their speech as fractured, full of riddles and spirals. One monk, when asked what they sought in the deep, answered simply, "We are not seeking. We are remembering what we agreed to forget." By the time the Mongol invasions began to threaten the region in the 13th century, the tunnels had already been emptied. Or rather, vacated. No bodies were found, no signs of struggle, just wells with no buckets, lanterns without flame, and stones still warm to the touch in rooms that hadn't seen breath in generations. And so, we return to the chain, the concept introduced beneath Ararat and now echoed back beneath Cappadocia. A chain not of iron, but of memory, a resonance of silence that binds not with force, but with agreement. What if these tunnels are not prisons, but pacts, structures of compliance, built by those who realized that certain truths, once awakened, could not be unlearned? The spiral symbol now found in both sites may hold the answer. In ancient symbolic geometry, the spiral is the shape of emergence, of ascent through descent, of knowledge unfolding backwards. The monks might have believed they were descending into darkness, but in truth they were ascending into something hidden, something forgotten not by accident, but by decision. And this decision, this burial of truth, did not begin with them. It may have stretched back to the very first human settlements. Göbekli Tepe, not far to the south, was deliberately buried by its own builders over 10,000 years ago. Why? Not to hide something, dangerous perhaps, but to seal something sacred, a knowing too pure to leave exposed. And what of the breath recorded in both locations, the rhythmic subterranean pulses matching across sites? If we interpret them not as literal breathing, but as a signal, then the question becomes, what is it responding to? Could it be triggered by noise, by frequency, by thought, or perhaps, most terrifying of all, it is triggered by remembrance, because once a memory is stirred, it cannot be buried again without a cost. Duarte, the acoustician, left one final note on a personal recording. He never released it publicly, but it was later transcribed by his assistant after his passing. In it he whispers, "I didn't hear a monster. I didn't hear a god. I heard myself, but older, but slower. As if something inside the earth knew me before I was born, and it asked only one question, why did you forget me?" And that is the legacy of the monks, not secrecy, not silence, but the burden of knowing. They opened a door beneath Cappadocia, and when they realized what it truly was, they did the only thing left that made sense. They left it open. And now we are the ones walking toward it. It is one thing to find a city buried in the earth. It is another to find it sealed from the inside. When Derinkuyu was rediscovered in 1963, what struck the archaeologist wasn't just the scale, it was the silence. Not a collapse, not decay, just absence. The kind of absence that doesn't happen by disaster but by decision. The city had been closed with care. Air vents were intact. Water channels were still operational. Storage rooms were organised. Stone wheels were rolled firmly across entry points. But there were no signs of who had done it, or why they had never returned. The lowest tunnels held no remains, no bones, no dust of old blankets or burnt-out lamps, only silence and the unmistakable geometry of purpose. These were not panic burrows scraped in haste. They were deliberate, thought-out structures, designed to last, designed to hide, and designed to be abandoned. For decades, historians assumed Derinkuyu's underground complexes were built during the early Byzantine era, a safe haven against invaders. But newer findings suggest something older. Stone carving methods used in the lower levels predate Roman tools. Some walls contain a strange mineral polish only found in Bronze Age Anatolia. And in one corridor, sealed behind a wheel too heavy for modern teams to move without assistance, a pattern was found etched into the stone. A swirling, tightly wound spiral that ended not in a point, but in a flat carved void. A symbol, perhaps, or a gate. This spiral matches markings found under Cappadocia, and even deeper beneath Mount Ararat. At first, scholars dismissed the connection. But when geological surveys revealed that seismic activity beneath all three sites often occurred simultaneously, the pattern could no longer be ignored. 3 locked, spaces 3 mountains of silence, 3 sealed entrances. But Derinkuyu was different, because Derinkuyu was lived in, and then one day, it wasn't. No legend survives of a massacre, no tale of plague or conquest. The monks who once prayed inside never spoke of loss, only disappearance. The records go quiet, as if an entire population slipped between breaths, leaving behind only stone and the shape of thought. In 2001, an independent group of Turkish spelunkers attempted to explore a lesser-known shaft within the Derinkuyu complex. They descended beyond the established paths, through a crack discovered behind an unfinished storeroom. What they found was a chamber with acoustics so perfect, their voices returned not as echoes but in altered tone, slower, deeper, as though the walls themselves were interpreting the speech before sending it back. They stayed less than 2 hours. One of them later wrote anonymously online, "We felt like we were being translated." That same year, a separate expedition unearthed a small collection of rusted tools buried in a sealed cache. The oddity: the tools didn't match known local methods of stone cutting. They were blunt, curved inward, and coated with traces of a now extinct bacterial compound known to soften limestone. Whoever left them didn't just carve the tunnels, they manipulated the stone chemically. Not just with force, but with knowledge now lost. But why leave? What drives a civilization to dig deep enough to survive anything, only to vanish by choice? One theory suggests they weren't hiding from enemies. They were hiding from what they had uncovered. There is evidence even in the upper levels of retrofitting. Rooms that once held frescoes were chipped clean. Chapels converted to storerooms, altars removed, as if at some point the beliefs of the surface no longer applied. In the lower levels the carvings shift. There are no crosses, no prayers, just spirals, handprints, and geometric patterns arranged in perfect proportions. One repeating shape resembles a human head with the top missing, as if knowledge had been poured in or extracted. But perhaps the clearest sign of transition lies in the doorways. Unlike upper passages, the lower gates are reinforced with basalt discs that slide sideways, not to block people, but to seal resonance. Tests show that when struck, these stones emit tones at 36 Hz, just low enough to affect human perception without conscious detection. The doors weren't for protection, they were for containment. So perhaps the people of Derinkuyu didn't flee outward. They fled inward, into silence, into surrender. And perhaps, at the very bottom, they reached a decision that what they had found could not be allowed to rise again. Which makes the disappearance not a mystery, but a warning. A 14th century Armenian priest once wrote about the buried city of monks who sealed their minds so the mountain would forget them. He never names Derinkuyu. But the phrase echoes. It suggests something profound, that the vanishing was not physical but cognitive, that they didn't run. They chose to disappear from thought, to become unspoken, to become unremembered, and here we are now, walking back into what they left behind, cracking open wheels they had locked from within, breathing the air they left behind, tuned with frequencies we no longer hear. And every time we descend into Derinkuyu, into Ararat, into the places the silence has preserved, we bring modern noise, machinery, thought, memory. We bring back the vibration. And what if vibration is the one thing they gave everything to suppress? Because if you listen too closely, if you let your breath match the silence, if you stay still long enough beneath that ancient stone, you begin to feel it. Not a presence, not a voice, but a memory waking up, one that doesn't belong to you, but still remembers you by name. Not all things that vanish are gone. Some retreat into the deep folds of memory, where the world forgets them, but the earth does not. And it is the earth, not man, that remembers with the most patience. The tunnels beneath Derinkuyu, once full of breath and ritual, are now left to dust and stillness. But even in stillness, the stone does not sleep. It waits. And sometimes it listens. The builders may have disappeared. Their names may have faded. But the shapes they carved remain. And so do the vibrations those shapes still hold. In 2015, a linguist named Farah Aslan from Ankara University came across a strange artifact retrieved from one of Derinkuyu's sealed niches. It was a flat stone tablet no larger than a palm, its face carved with looping inscriptions that bore no resemblance to Greek, Latin, or any Anatolian dialect. What caught her attention wasn't just the symbols, it was the way they flowed. Not in lines, but in spirals, like thought returning to itself. The script seemed to move inwards, as if guiding the reader not across meaning, but into it. Farah spent months trying to decipher it. She began with comparative glyphs, hoping to match symbols with known scripts. But what emerged was more unsettling than unfamiliarity. The symbols on the tablet seemed to shift meaning depending on the angle of observation. When rotated, the same glyph resembled different phonetic families. The language, she concluded, wasn't fixed. It responded. It behaved like a memory coded in stone, one that reconfigured itself according to the reader's state. And then the dreams began. She started to hear words in her sleep, low, slow, phonemes, spoken not in language, but in feeling. When she woke, the carvings made more sense. Not literal translations, but impressions. The words on the tablet were not instructions or records. They were echoes of something that had been thought once, by a people who had no word for forgetting. One night, she traced the spiral backward with her finger and wrote a single phrase in her notebook. Without realizing, we did not descend to escape. We descended to obey. That sentence would lead her to re-examine Derinkuyu entirely. She hypothesized that the lowest levels were not a place of refuge, but of initiation. Not hiding from war, but surrendering to something older. Something spoken not in command, but in presence. In her next visit to the site, she asked to be left alone in the same chamber where the tablet was discovered. With no lights, no camera, just a hand recorder and silence. After 30 minutes of stillness, her device began to pick up a low, sustained hum. Not mechanical, not natural. A hum tuned to the same frequency as a human heartbeat at rest. Then the hum stopped. A new sound replaced it. Tapping. 5 taps. A pause. 3 taps. A pause. One long, dragging scrape. When she returned to the surface, she said only one thing. It replied. In the months that followed, her research shifted entirely. She stopped publishing, stopped attending academic gatherings. Her colleagues noted her growing isolation, but those close to her said she had become quiet in a different way, not withdrawn, focused, as though she was listening to something the rest of them could not hear. Her last recorded statement before vanishing from public view was scribbled in a margin beside a scan of the tablet. It read, "They didn't build the tunnels to survive. They built them to tune themselves, to become resonance itself." This idea, the idea that the builders of Derinkuyu had sought not to hide but to transform, led to new questions. What happens when a group of people willingly retreats from the world, not for fear, not for religion, but to become silence? What if they believed that resonance, not speech, was the original language? That truth was not learned through eyes or tongues, but through frequency. Other sites across Anatolia have since been re-examined through this lens. Subterranean rooms in Nevşehir, long thought to be cellars or storage spaces, have wall carvings that respond to deep vocal drones. One chamber amplifies sound only when a certain pitch is sustained, implying not just accidental acoustics, but intentional frequency design. These aren't the signs of refugees. They are the traces of a civilization that believed understanding could only come by lowering yourself into silence, far beneath the world of noise, until you found something that no longer needed words. And perhaps, at the bottom of Derinkuyu, that's exactly what they found. Or perhaps they didn't find it at all. Perhaps it found them. An old oral tradition in the region tells of the quiet ones who live beneath the earth, who are not seen, but who call to those who are already half listening. These calls, according to local herders, come in the form of memory fog, the sense that you're walking into a place you've never seen, but somehow recognize, the sensation that the air around you remembers your name, even when you've forgotten it yourself. In one version of the tale, a man descends into a cave to avoid a coming storm. He lights no fire, he says no prayer, he simply waits, and in the dark he hears the stone breathe. When he emerges, he has no beard, no name, and does not speak. But he writes symbols in the sand with his finger, spirals that confuse the village elder and frighten the shepherds. The villagers ask who he is. He smiles, points downward, and mouths a single word: return. That tale is older than the written record, and it bears eerie resemblance to the accounts surrounding the sudden abandonment of Derinkuyu. What if the builders did not leave overnight? What if they were unwritten, not killed, not migrated, but taken out of the rhythm of history like a beat skipped in a song too vast to notice one missing note? Perhaps the spirals weren't decorations, they were signatures, coordinates, reminders for whoever would come next. We left this path open, but don't descend unless you are willing to forget the surface. And now, we descend again, but not through devotion or obedience, but through curiosity, through excavation, through machines that hum and drills that vibrate, through frequencies that no longer ask permission. And if the stone is still listening, as all signs suggest it is, then we must wonder, do we really know what we're waking up? Or worse, what if it doesn't want to be woken, because it never really slept? There is a kind of silence that does not settle. It remains. It lingers in the walls of places long abandoned, in doorways that open to nothing, in stairs carved by hands that were never found. Derinkuyu is one of those places, a city built not to be lived in, but to be forgotten correctly. Not neglected, but sealed. And if the builders disappeared without trace, it may be because they succeeded in a kind of vanishing that has nothing to do with escape, and everything to do with agreement. You can walk its corridors today, you can touch the walls, breathe the cooled air, count the steps downward, but you cannot feel what they felt. Not fully. Something has changed, or perhaps something has returned. In the upper levels there is still light, still history. You can see the remnants of a people, tools, grooves, storage pits, even the channels they used to store water and wine. But the deeper you go, the more these signs vanish. And then, beyond the point archaeologists stop counting, the spaces begin to change. Geometry softens, pathways lose logic, rooms seem to breathe around you rather than sit before you. It's not disorientation, it's retuning. It is said that in the lowest known corridor, if you stand still long enough with no light, the air begins to pulse, not with temperature, but with presence. No wind moves, yet your skin shifts, not with fear, but with recognition, as if something is slowly shaping your body back into a shape it once knew, and forgot. In 2018, a joint study between Turkish and German researchers sought to map the full acoustic fingerprint of Derinkuyu's lower chambers. What they found shocked even the most sceptical. At a particular depth, the ambient frequency stabilized at 111 Hz, a tone known in psychoacoustic studies to induce mild trance-like states in the human brain. The researchers did not publish this directly. It was noted only in their internal logs, alongside a series of unusual notes. Participants report strange dream recall. Perception of space altered. No sense of time after 15 minutes exposure. One technician wrote anonymously in a personal blog, "I stood there, in that stone room, for what I thought was 10 minutes. I came out 3 hours later. I remember nothing except the feeling that the stone was humming in my breath." This opens up an eerie possibility, that the people who once lived here didn't leave physically. They were absorbed, not devoured, not destroyed, but drawn into the memory of the structure itself. As if the resonance of the place was not just a byproduct, but a gate. That might explain why no skeletal remains have been found in the lowest levels, why no graves exist for those who carved these walls. Perhaps their exit from history was not upward or outward, but inward, into the walls, into the echo, into the chain of frequency that binds these places, Derinkuyu, Cappadocia, Mount Ararat, and perhaps even deeper chambers still undiscovered. Farah Aslan's notes found months after her disappearance support this theory. In her final annotated sketches, she circled one spiral over and over again and wrote, "They moved into the pause between sound. Where memory cannot follow, where history does not echo, it sounds like poetry, until you see the same spiral again in another place." In 2021, deep beneath the ancient site of Mardin, far southeast of Cappadocia, construction workers uncovered a carved wall bearing that same spiral. It was not part of any known religious tradition in the region. It bore no symbols of empire or kingdom, but the stone beneath it, once tapped, gave off the same 111 Hz frequency. A month later, the chamber flooded. Not from rain, not from a broken pipe, but from groundwater that had previously shown no presence, as if the earth itself had risen to close the door. These repeated patterns, spirals, resonance, vanishing, point to something coordinated, something not confined to Derinkuyu alone. The builders, it seems, were part of a broader rhythm, a migration not of territory but of understanding. They weren't escaping Rome or plague, they weren't running from sword or flame, they were responding to a call, one not shouted across time but whispered into stone. And perhaps, in the end, they answered not with rebellion, but with disappearance. What kind of civilization chooses to remove itself from history? What do they know that we have forgotten? What if their final act wasn't to survive, but to protect us from what they had found? There are stories in this region, too consistent across villages to be dismissed, of a final group long before the Ottomans who walked downward and were never seen again. The tale says they were marked not by name, but by their quiet, that their silence could quiet others, that if one of them placed a hand on your chest you would stop dreaming for 7 days, and in those 7 days the world would seem louder, as if you had forgotten how to listen properly. Maybe that's what Derinkuyu really is. Not just a city, not just a lock, but a pause carved into the flesh of the earth, a moment made of stone, placed between us and something that must never be recalled too quickly. And now, with modern tools, modern machines, modern curiosity, we have begun to press play again. But every pause, once broken, unleashes what it was holding back. And if that frequency returns, if that pulse beneath the tunnels grows louder, then perhaps we should not be asking why the builders vanished. Perhaps we should be asking, what if they're still here, just one vibration away from being remembered again? On the island of Malta, far from the volcanic hush of Ararat and the spiraled tunnels of Cappadocia, there lies a chamber that hums without song. The hippodrome of Hal Saflieni, buried beneath the quiet suburb of Paola, was not meant to be found, and yet, in 1902, it was. Not by archaeologists, not by explorers, but by accident, when builders broke through the ceiling of its uppermost level while laying foundations for a new house. What they uncovered was not a tomb, not a shelter, but a wound in the earth that never fully closed. At first, they believed it to be a burial complex. Human remains were found in abundance, thousands of skeletons, some in strange postures, others in perfect stillness. But it was the architecture that refused to make sense. Rooms curved where straight lines should be, passages narrowed into black slits and then widened again like lungs, and the stone, limestone but unnaturally smooth, reflected sound in impossible ways. A whisper could travel entire corridors, a hum could shake your bones from across the chamber. It was not built for the dead, it was built for listening. and at the centre of it all lay a room now known as the oracle chamber. Roughly oval in shape, the chamber had a single niche cut into one wall, no larger than a man's head. When someone stood in front of that niche and spoke in a low voice, the chamber answered, not with echo, not with distortion, but with resonance. The sound didn't bounce, it bloomed. Vibrations danced along the bones of every listener. Frequencies rose and fell as if the room itself were correcting the speaker's tone, forcing it to match a buried harmonic standard. Tests conducted in the late 20th century confirmed that the oracle chamber amplifies sound at exactly 110 Hz, the same frequency recorded beneath Derinkuyu, the same pulse that echoed under Ararat, a frequency that affects the human brain's prefrontal cortex, the seat of intuition, of nonverbal knowing. Those exposed to prolonged tones at 110 Hz reported altered states of awareness, heightened presence, disconnection from time. But long before any scientist confirmed this, the local guides already knew. They warned visitors not to sing into the chamber too long, that it was rude to linger in that tone, that if the oracle chamber liked your voice, you would never stop hearing it. One guide in the 1960s went missing for a full day. He was found wandering near the lowest level, barefoot and bleeding from the soles, whispering in a language no one could place. When he recovered, he refused to speak again, but in his notebook they found a single phrase written over and over. It isn't a voice, it's a listener. This idea, that the hippodrome itself listens, was once dismissed as local superstition, but the deeper researchers dug, the more impossible the site became. Carbon dating places its construction at over 6,000 years ago. That's before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, and no known tools from that period could have shaped stone so precisely. More bizarrely, the structure appears to have been carved from a single living bedrock, with no clear indication of scaffolding or error. As if whoever built it did not construct it, they revealed it. Even stranger was what lay beneath the lowest floor. In 1925, during further exploration, a spiral staircase was found leading to an undocumented level. No light reached it, no air moved. The chamber at the bottom was empty, except for a single indentation in the floor, circular, deep and smooth as glass. Later, when instruments were brought in to measure the chamber's acoustic properties, the team discovered that a human hum held at a precise tone would cause the entire floor to vibrate ever so slightly. Not enough to be felt, but enough to move a single grain of dust in a continuous spiral across the indentation, always inward, never outward. And that's when the rumours began again. Not about gods, not about death, but about frequencies, about tones that call to something older than bones, that perhaps the hypogeum wasn't just an echo chamber, it was a kind of tuner, a reset mechanism, a place where the human voice could be tested against something beyond it. And if it matched, if it resonated, it would unlock a different kind of memory, one not stored in the mind but in frequency itself. In the 1930s, a visiting German researcher named Otto Koenig claimed that the structure's design resembled something far too modern for its age, a three-dimensional harmonic cavity, like the body of a musical instrument scaled for consciousness. He wrote privately, "We are not standing in a tomb. We are standing inside a thought that thought may not have been human." For the skeletons uncovered in the hippodrome showed subtle but consistent anomalies: elongated skulls, shallow eye sockets, a high cranial dome with a narrow jaw, traits not unknown in ancient populations but found here in abundance. Many of these remains were lost in the chaos of World War II, but a few were documented. One report, now largely buried in old archives, described the skulls as having the architecture of sound, not battle. What that meant was never explained. And then there were the doors, not doors in the usual sense, but small carved passageways that seemed to lead nowhere, too narrow for a person, too shallow for airflow. And yet, when sound was introduced into them, especially the human voice, those same passageways responded, not with words, but with a sensation, cold skin, tingling limbs, sudden flashes of memory that did not belong to the person experiencing them. One researcher compared it to hearing someone else's past through your own nerves. This is not folklore. These are field notes. Anecdotal, yes, but consistent across decades. And they suggest one chilling idea, that the hippodrome is not meant for worship, not meant for burial. It is meant for transmission. A frequency that reaches back into the bone and asks, "Do you remember the silence before language? Do you remember what it meant before you had words to carry it? What if the hypogeum is part of the same system as Derinkuyu and Ararat? Not geographically, but structurally. A harmonic gate. A spiral map built into the crust of the world. One meant to hold something down, or remind it of its form. A silence so old it needed monuments to remember how to be. And what if the voice the hypogeum listens for hasn't been heard in a very, very long time? Perhaps that's why the place was sealed, why later civilizations buried it. Because someone finally said the wrong word at the right pitch. Someone unlocked something that did not belong in time, and then someone had to seal it shut again. Not with stones, but with forgetting. But the memory is rising. The chamber still hums, and the spiral still spins inward, grain by grain. So the question is not who built it, or even why. The question is, what is it still waiting to hear? Most sites fade, ruins crumble, legends soften into metaphor, and the world moves on. But the hypogeum of Malta does not fade. It doesn't allow itself to be reduced to legend. It remains, not through preservation, but through presence. It lingers beneath the feet of those who walk above, like an unfinished sentence buried beneath their thoughts. There is no temple like it, no tomb that behaves the same. It wasn't made to explain anything. It was made to remember what should not be spoken aloud. After the accidental rediscovery in 1902, something strange began happening to those who spent long hours inside. Not sickness, not injury, but dislocation. They began forgetting time, measurements, words. One British engineer, tasked with cataloguing the internal dimensions of the oracle chamber, noted that his instruments read differently each time he passed the threshold. "It's as if the space doesn't stay put," he wrote. "You think you've measured it, then you turn around and it's somewhere else." Others described the sensation of being watched from inside their own thoughts, not haunted, not possessed, just accompanied. The local workers, long before the site became public, warned that staying underground too long could confuse your name. At first, these warnings sounded like superstition, but over time, visitors and researchers began reporting similar effects: mild auditory distortions, déjà vu, sudden nausea followed by intense calm, and always the feeling that something was listening. Not nearby, but beneath, as though the chamber wasn't a room at all, but a mouth, half open. And then came the children. In the early 1900s, when the hypogeum was still largely unregulated, a school group was allowed to descend with their teacher and a local guide. According to the guide, the children wandered too far, drawn by a tunnel not listed in the excavation maps. The guide followed, but the tunnel seemed to lengthen, narrow, darken. Only a few returned. The rest were never found. The official report labelled it a tragic miscount. Poor lighting, panic, confusion. But locals say otherwise. They say the chamber was hungry that day. Decades later, the entrance to that tunnel was sealed. But even now, strange sounds are occasionally reported beneath the floors above it. Low pulses, footsteps with no weight, and once, only once, a recording taken from a small monitoring microphone picked up what sounded like children humming. No words, just a melody. One that spiraled downward and never repeated. There are no more tours to that level, but not all entrances are made of stone. In 2008, an Italian acoustic physicist named Dr. Gianluca Trevisano entered the oracle chamber with permission to conduct an extended study. His instruments were state-of-the-art, capable of mapping resonance in high resolution. But what he recorded defied simulation. The chamber not only responded to certain frequencies, it anticipated them. When a pure tone was played, the walls generated subtle pre-frequencies milliseconds before the sound arrived, as if they already knew what was coming, as if the chamber wasn't echoing but listening ahead. Trevisano wrote, "It's not just resonant, it's predictive. The room understands sound like a memory understands a smell." He likened the chamber's response to the way human neurons fire in anticipation of music. The hypogeum was not a static structure. It was an active process. He began humming. Each night he returned to the chamber, reduced his instruments, and relied only on his voice. He claimed he began to feel answers, not hear them, but receive them, like heat through glass. He became convinced that the spiral structures carved in the hypogeum were not symbols, but scores, not for music, but for thought, and that the builders had left them behind not as art, but as permission. His last recording, published posthumously, was a low droning chant that lasted 11 minutes. At precisely 7 minutes and 13 seconds the tone wavered, not from his voice, but from the room. A secondary hum emerged, identical in pitch, but deeper, older, like the original tone had been mirrored back from below. Treviano's voice stopped. The recording continued for 4 more minutes, just the sound of stone, remembering. He vanished 3 weeks later. His apartment was empty, his notes gone. Only his recorder remained, humming softly when investigators found it, though the battery was long dead. Some now believe the hypogeum is a harmonic archive, a place where thoughts are stored not in words or images, but in resonance signatures. And those who match the frequency begin to download memories that were never theirs, which leads to a deeper question. Whose memories are they? What kind of mind carves chambers not to preserve bodies, but to echo thought across epochs? In 2013, a French geologist proposed an outrageous theory, that the hypogeum is a node in a global acoustic grid, a network of resonant chambers built not for travel but for remembrance, from Derinkuyu to Ararat to Hypogeum and beyond. Sites aligned not by distance, but by tone, by vibration, and perhaps, when enough of those tones are reactivated, when enough voices return to the song, we won't unlock a message, we'll become one. Because the hypogeum isn't waiting for a visitor, it's waiting for a choir. And once enough of the chambers hum again in the right sequence, whatever was buried, not under soil but under silence, will remember its form. Not as myth, not as history, but as presence. And so the oracle chamber remains sealed from deeper access. The rooms beneath it left in darkness, the spirals half mapped, the frequencies half measured, but the stone still listens, the hum still waits, and the spiral still leads inward. So ask yourself, not if the hypogeum speaks. Ask yourself, if it ever answers again, will it answer in your voice? The hypogeum doesn't end with its walls. It continues in those who return from it changed, quiet, uncertain, glancing at shadows not because they fear them, but because something in them recognizes something in the dark. For all its rooms and corridors, it's not a structure of space, it's a structure of intention. Every carved spiral, every acoustically tuned surface is a message, not to the future, but to the past we buried too early. And if those messages were meant to echo, the question is no longer what they said, but what they were protecting us from remembering. A lesser-known detail lies within a side chamber seldom shown to tourists. Unlike the Grand Oracle Room, this space is crooked, asymmetrical, its surfaces slightly warped. Archaeologists once dismissed it as a quarry chamber, where tools were stored, where stone was initially extracted. But in 1999, a visiting neuroacoustic technician discovered something peculiar. When standing alone in the centre of this chamber, the human heart rate aligns, after 8 minutes, with the same frequency emitted in the oracle chamber. No sound is required, just stillness. The implication was staggering. The space itself adjusts you, not with sound, but with geometry. It's not simply that the hypogeum responds to resonance, it produces it, without movement, without heat. A passive signal tuned to a pattern buried not in culture or myth, but in the body itself. Not a building, a signal emitter. This may explain why so many who descend into its depths return with the same story, of dreams, vivid, specific, and eerily consistent. Dreams of corridors stretching endlessly, not through rock but through memory. Dreams where the walls pulse gently, and in the distance a low hum rises, not threatening, not inviting, but inevitable. A sound you feel you've heard before, though no instrument could replicate it. Like a lullaby hummed before your species had a name. In one account, an Irish archaeologist wrote that she had a recurring vision after her descent into the hypogeum. In it she stood in a chamber that looked like no room she'd entered, but one that belonged to her. She would press her palm to a stone slab, and her bones would vibrate with warmth. Not heat, not pressure, but recognition. And behind her, always behind her, something was listening. Not stalking, not hiding. Just waiting for her to remember what she had promised never to say again. She stopped her excavation work the following year, because it's not what the hypogeum contains that frightens those who understand it. It's what it asks you to retrieve, and perhaps that's why the oldest parts remain sealed. A report buried in the early 20th century archives, never digitized, seldom quoted, mentions a lost tunnel discovered during early excavations. It was too narrow to walk through upright, but wide enough for sound to pass with perfect clarity. One worker crawled in. He never came back. A rope was pulled out, but it came back shredded. Not by rock, not by tools, but as if pulled apart fibre by fibre. The lead archaeologist at the time ordered it closed. When questioned, he said only, "That tunnel was not carved from the outside." Not carved from the outside, so then, by what? By whom? And if that tunnel was meant for something else, something that doesn't walk or breathe the way we do, then the hypogeum isn't a monument, it's an interface. Not for worship, not for burial, but for translation. Translation of something older than language. Something that still remembers its shape, but only in certain tones. Which might explain why the oracle chamber isn't the deepest room. Below it, documented only in one abandoned file, is a second chamber, sealed by what appears to be a collapsed ceiling. But no one ever found the debris. No. Records show rubble being cleared. And yet, the chamber above carries faint, anomalous pulses, recorded 3 times between 1974 and 1989, matching the low-end infrasonic hum documented under Derinkuyu and Mount Ararat. As if the same voice is speaking from under different names. A voice not of volume, but of pattern. If all these places are connected, not through roads, not through timelines, but through a forgotten design language, then perhaps the hypogeum wasn't a destination at all. It was a node, a terminal, a mouth of something older that wanted only to be heard once more. That would explain the spiral carvings, why they appear again and again, not just in Malta, but in Anatolia, in Peru, in the Caucasus, and in the empty depths beneath Ararat. Spirals that don't symbolize movement outward, but descent inward. Spirals that map not places, but resonances. Pathways back into a frequency we abandoned. Maybe the builders of these places weren't trying to contain anything. Maybe they were hiding us from a voice we once understood too well. One final note. In 2016, an unauthorized visitor broke into the lower levels of the hypogeum. His phone was later recovered near the chamber entrance. It contained no video, no audio, just a single unfinished text message saved in his drafts folder. It read, "It doesn't sleep, it just listens, waiting for the last sound it was built to carry. And maybe that sound is yours. There are mountains that were made by tectonic force, carved by wind and shaped by water. And then there are mountains that feel placed, as though someone once set them down with a deliberate hand. Mount Gilboa, rising in a broken line across northern Israel, belongs to the latter. It does not tower, it does not echo, but it remembers. Not because of the wars fought near its slopes, not because of the psalms that wept across its name, but because beneath its skin there is a silence that was never natural, the kind that suggests something was buried and then sealed with great effort. The region has long been considered holy ground, not just in scripture, but in legend. It was here that King Saul, in desperation and defiance, turned to a witch. It was here that the battle turned against him, and it was here that he fell, body torn, spirit cursed, the mountains around him left to bear witness to a memory too sacred to be told completely. And yet, those stories never descended beyond the surface. But the miners did. In the late 1800s, a small British venture began extracting limestone from the lower ridges of Gilboa. It was quiet work, unprofitable, slow, and eventually abandoned. But not before something was found. Not gold, not oil, not treasure, but a gap. A pocket of air where there should have been none. A hollow chamber not formed by erosion, but by intention. The men lowered a lamp and dropped a rope. What they found was neither natural cavern nor constructed tunnel. It was a room, irregular, tall, with claw-like indentations along its curved walls, as though something had scraped the interior before turning to stone. At the far end of the chamber lay a skeleton, at least what they called a skeleton. It was unlike anything they had seen. Not monstrous, not animal, humanoid, but too tall, too long. The limbs bent oddly. The skull was slightly sloped, with deep sockets and no remaining teeth. The miners fled. The chamber was sealed. The report was lost in the paperwork of a dying colonial outpost. But one of the workers, a Jewish labourer named Eliyahu ben Kedar, wrote a letter to his rabbi before disappearing from public record. The letter spoke of a fallen watcher and warned he was not dead. He was only set aside. The story might have remained folklore, another miner's tale to fill a quiet night, until 1978, when the Israeli Geological Survey began mapping the Gilboa region for potential aquifers. In a remote valley, a team used ground-penetrating radar and discovered anomalies below the shale, chambers spaced in regular intervals, each precisely 32 metres apart, connected by narrow shafts. There was no known history of ancient habitation that deep in the soil, and yet the formations suggested not residence, but restraint, like coffins cut into stone. One of those shafts was bored into. Nothing was removed, but the audio recording captured during the probe revealed a low vibration, not seismic, not mechanical, a droning tone, steady, unbroken, not heard through the air but through equipment shielding. A technician, listening to the feed, suffered a sudden drop in blood pressure and collapsed. When revived, he could only say, "I thought it was breathing." After that incident, the study was quietly defunded, but not before copies of the scans were leaked to a private university in Jerusalem. There, a professor of ancient Near Eastern texts compared the layout of the Gilboa chambers to an obscure passage in the Book of Jubilees, one speaking of the ones buried beneath the high places, so that their breath would not reach the surface again. It was a passage long dismissed as apocryphal metaphor, until the pattern beneath Gilboa matched it perfectly. The connection deepened when an unmarked fragment of basalt, recovered from a shallow pit on the northern slope of the mountain, was found to bear strange grooves, not cut, not chiselled, but melted into the surface. When run through contour analysis software, the grooves aligned with an audio waveform, a resonance signature, and not just any signature, the exact same frequency detected in the oracle chamber of Malta's hypogum, 110 Hz, again. The spiral returned too. In another uncovered chamber, now collapsed, photographs from the early 20th century expedition showed a wall with a faint carving, a spiral descending into a hand, its fingers outstretched downward, not upward, always spiralling inward, always inviting descent, never ascent. What then was Gilboa? Resting place? A prison? Or worse, a network node, like during Kuyu and the Hypogeum? A place where those once cast down were not merely buried, but stored. The rabbis speak cautiously of the Nephilim. They are rarely named. When they are often referred to in past tense as warnings, but not all references are so final. A Talmudic commentary, buried in obscure scrolls from Safed, makes mention of those below the earth who sleep for the sake of the covenant, until the memory of their voice is broken. What memory? What voice? What kind of covenant requires giants to be silenced in stone? And if the ones beneath Gilboa were once watchers, beings cursed to fall for transgressing divine boundaries, then why do the chambers that hold them match sacred geometries across continents? Unless those punishments were never punishments at all, unless they were containment agreements, old ones, kept not just by God and angel, but by us. Maybe the ancient builders weren't saving themselves. Maybe they were helping the fallen forget who they once were. And maybe, just maybe, the problem is they're starting to remember, because the vibration beneath Gilboa has returned, and the miners who found the chamber over a century ago, not one left a burial record, not one had descendants, as if the mountain took them back. When you cut into the bones of a mountain, you expect to find resistance, rock, pressure, silence. But what the team drilling into Mount Gilboa found in the spring of 1994 was something no instrument could explain. Not a cavity, not water, not even air, but yield. As if, instead of resisting, the mountain allowed the drill to pass, only up to a point. Then the shaft struck something not soft, not hard, but reverberant, and everything changed. The drill's vibrations began to return out of phase, wobbling erratically on the readouts. Operators assumed a mechanical fault. They reversed the bore. But as the equipment retracted, the team heard something. Not on the surface, not in the air, in their bodies. A low cycling tone, like pressure under the skin, a subtle internal hum that made teeth ache and eyes water. It lasted only seconds. But from that point on, every tool placed into the borehole malfunctioned. 3 days later, the lead engineer resigned. He would not speak of it publicly, but in a private letter obtained years later he wrote, "It was as if the mountain pushed back, not violently, like it wanted us to listen before we asked again. Geological readings from the site showed nothing out of the ordinary, but the drill data, when reviewed by a seismic acoustics specialist, revealed something else. Harmonic interference patterns, not random, not geological, but structured, like layered tones, almost musical but flattened, stacked atop one another in descending intervals." The expert's final comment was short. "These aren't echoes, they're blueprints." This possibility changed everything. If the mountain was producing patterned frequencies, it meant it was acting not as passive material, but as a resonant body. And if it was resonating, something within it was generating those tones, something designed, something tuned, something aware of rhythm. A separate anomaly came to light shortly after. Decades-old aerial photographs taken before vegetation overran the southern slopes revealed geometric shapes in the terrain, so subtle they could only be seen from above. Long parallel ridges, curved mounds at regular spacing, a ringed depression near the peak, shallow but unnaturally circular. At ground level, these were indistinct, random hills. But from the air they formed a spiral, again, not etched, not built, buried. As if the mountain was once covered with an arrangement, later camouflaged by time. One Israeli archaeologist proposed a radical theory, that the entire southern face of Mount Gilboa was not natural at all, but formed, terraformed by an ancient civilization using methods we no longer understand. He was dismissed, his paper retracted. But he stood by one statement. The Earth here is not just Earth. It is memory compacted. Something, or someone, shaped it not to be seen, but to be felt. Meanwhile, the spiral reappeared in an unexpected place. A small metal amulet recovered from a burial site in a nearby valley bore an engraving, a coiled symbol that, when unrolled and measured, mirrored a mathematical pattern found in wave interference. Not exactly Fibonacci, not golden ratio, but something else. A descending pattern of halves, narrowing toward an unreachable centre. A tone spiral, not for decoration, for tuning. Its composition, an unusual alloy with traces of vanadium, was out of place for its dated period, at least 2,000 years old. Too advanced, too intentional. Its placement on the body, over the heart, as if meant to mute or align. Some now suspect it was a resonance lock, a safeguard, worn by those who had come too close to the mountain's lower hum. Then came the accident. In 2003, a controlled excavation near Gilboa's abandoned shaft collapsed unexpectedly. No explosives were used, no major stress registered on the surface. But the core of the rock gave way in a sudden pulse, as though something breathed out. A technician at the nearby seismology centre described it as a tremor with no echo. The quake never travelled beyond its point of origin. At the same time, residents of a village 6 kilometres away reported a sound, a long, low droning noise that passed through their homes but did not rattle windows or objects. A grandmother said it made her bones feel older than they were. A child described it as the sound my dreams make before I wake up. It lasted 6 minutes, and then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it began, researchers scrambled for answers, but nothing conclusive was published. Unofficially, one man had a theory. Yosef Halim, a retired engineer turned private researcher, had been studying the acoustic anomalies of sacred sites for decades. He believed Mount Gilboa, like Derinkuyu and the Hypogeum, was part of an ancient frequency lattice, a web of subterranean harmonic gates tuned to maintain balance between surface thought and buried knowledge. To him, the quake wasn't random. It was a release valve. Something inside was adjusting its resonance, reacting to being heard. He warned, if you press too hard, the mountain won't break. You will. His model showed that when frequencies like 110 Hz or 36 Hz are exposed to natural bedrock for long durations, harmonic chambers can form, amplifying and storing vibration across centuries. And if you disturb the balance of those frequencies, even slightly, you activate the memory stored inside. What kind of memory? He called it a sleeping intelligence made of rhythm, not flesh. He believed the builders, those who once walked taller than men and carved chambers beneath Ararat and Derinkuyu, had used tone not as a weapon, but as a veil, a way to keep certain thoughts from being reawakened, a lullaby to the earth itself. But when modern tools cut too deep, when drills replaced whispers, the lullaby breaks, and what wakes is not violent. It is curious, it is patient, it is old enough to wait without moving. Halim died in 2007. His last paper was never completed. But in his final draft he wrote, "We are measuring echoes of something that once made itself small enough to fit inside stone. It did not die, it nested, and every time we vibrate the mountain, we feed it memory again." The Israeli Antiquities Authority has since closed all drilling projects near Mount Gilboa, officially for preservation. Unofficially, they've never explained the increasing acoustic interference that now distorts communications in the region, especially underground, and beneath it all the chambers remain, quiet, unentered, but no longer still. Because what the miners found was not a giant, it was the first proof that giants had learned how to sleep in sound, and the only thing more dangerous than waking them is waking what they buried with them. When a body's buried, it begins to fade, skin into dust, breath into silence. But some things resist burial, not with violence, not with fire, with remembrance. The kind that seeps slowly through stone, vibrating beneath generations, waiting not to be uncovered, but remembered correctly. And beneath Mount Gilboa, what was buried did not decay. It resonated, as if the earth could not forget what it had been asked to hold, as if stone could only suppress memory for so long before it began to hum. In the winter of 2010, a small academic team from Tel Aviv University conducted a passive acoustic test near the southern ridge of Gilboa, unaware of the old mining records, unaware of the sealed shaft hidden beneath the roots of scrub and cypress. Their equipment was simple: vibration sensors, subsonic, microphones and soil resonance calibrators. But what they recorded was anything but simple. At 3:11 a.m., with no wind and no visible motion, the ground emitted a signal, barely perceptible, yet sharply defined. A low-frequency pulse, repeating every 44 seconds, stretching across nearly an hour. No animal, no geological event, just a steady, measured tone. One that matched the precise spacing of the sealed subterranean chambers mapped half a century earlier. The team was shaken, but curious. They returned the next night and the night after that. The signal returned only once more, on the 7th night. This time it lasted 3 hours. One researcher reported hearing the walls of my skull tighten, while another described a sudden surge of emotional memory. Moments from childhood, forgotten sounds, the taste of earth. Nothing external had changed, but the mountain had spoken, not in language, but in recognition. Like a locked door testing its hinges after centuries of stillness. Word spread quietly through academic circles. The site was flagged, but never closed. Too obscure, too quiet. But in the following months, other anomalies surfaced. In a nearby village, shepherds began reporting unusual behaviour in their flocks. Animals refused to graze near certain outcrops, avoiding them with precise margins, as if repelled by an invisible border. 2 goats were found dead. Not injured, not sick, but stiff with jaws open and tongues swollen. A veterinarian attributed it to shock, but the herder disagreed. They heard something they couldn't close, he said, not with their ears, with their bones. Shortly after, a local boy vanished while exploring a shallow cave on Gilboa's northern slope. He returned 2 days later, barefoot, silent, clothes torn, not by thorns, but by friction against smooth surfaces. When asked where he'd been, he whispered, "Under the song." The spiral was found again, etched crudely into a slab buried beneath centuries of dust. The same descending pattern appeared, this time alongside a new symbol, a mouth, closed, surrounded by circles. One linguist suggested it was a representation of containment. Another thought it was instruction, a command not to speak. But who were the instructions for? The builders? The giants? Or us? If the chambers beneath Gilboa held anything, it wasn't bodies. It was consequence, a slow consequence, like breath trapped beneath ice, building with every passing decade. The chambers weren't tombs. They were decisions, and those decisions were made long before human calendars began counting. A fragment of parchment from the Qumran caves, long overlooked, mentions the 7 beneath the mountain who do not forget. The context is unclear, but when cross-referenced with an obscure midrash, a pattern emerges. Gilboa is named not just as the site of Saul's fall, but as a mountain that rejected divine rain, a cursed peak, not because it failed, but because it refused to allow something above it to return. What if that refusal wasn't metaphor? What if the mountain itself was part of a pact? A compact between beings who once walked the surface and those who were forced below it. Not enemies, not angels, not demons, but witnesses. And if the giants of Gilboa were not warriors or rebels, but recorders, beings who remembered too much, who carried sound and structure that could fracture the surface world, then their burial wasn't revenge, it was mercy. Because memory, when it vibrates unchecked, can tear through everything built on top of it, which may explain why so many spiral sites across the world seem to awaken together. Not by design, not by trigger, but by resonance drift. Our machines, our satellites, our mining, our constant push to extract from the earth what it buried in silence. We are shaking the skin of something that was never meant to be disturbed, and like a body remembering an old scar, the earth is pulsing with warning. In 2022, a new seismic anomaly rippled beneath Gilboa. It was not deep, not shallow. It moved sideways, like a line being drawn across the map, connecting points yet unseen. The tremor was quiet, felt by no human feet. But sensors lit up from Anatolia to the Jordan Valley. The frequency. 110 Hz. Again. Still. Always. And that is the final breath of this story. Not a conclusion, not a revelation. Just a tone. A reminder that beneath Mount Gilboa lies something unfinished. Something watching the spiral of sound we've begun to trace again. Not to stop us, but to remember with us. Because if the giants of Gilboa were placed in the earth to forget what they once carried, then what happens now when we finally teach the mountain how to listen again? Sardinia lies quietly in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, closer to myth than map. It does not announce itself like Egypt or Greece. Its stones do not scream with grandeur. They whisper. Through overgrown hills and valleys dusted in salt wind, the island sleeps beneath centuries of deliberate forgetting. But there is one place where the forgetting stops, where the memory is so carefully etched into the bedrock that time itself seems unsure how to proceed. That place is known as the Tombs of the Giants, and it is here that the silence becomes language again. To the eye, they resemble elongated graves, massive slabs of stone laid in a row, narrowing at the top like the spine of something ancient trying to rise. Locals call them tumbas de sos gigante, but they do not mean giants metaphorically. The stories passed down in the villages do not speak of kings or myth. They speak of beings who once lay down in these stones, not buried in death, but placed in waiting. And when the wind moves through certain tombs at dusk, it does not howl, it tones, a low constant note, as if the stone is trying to remember what it once carried. Archaeologists date the tombs to the Bronze Age Nuragic culture, 1800 BCE, or earlier. But the structure of the tombs defies simple funerary purpose. Each begins with a semicircular forecourt of standing stones, often called a horned layout, facing precisely east. At sunrise, light enters the court and touches the largest central stone, the portal. Beyond that, a narrow channel flanked by heavy slabs leads into the tomb chamber, longer than a man but too narrow for any proper ritual procession. The walls are polished, the air is cold even in midsummer, and always the sense that something once stretched in these corridors, not horizontally, but deep into time. In 1994, an Italian acoustics team from the University of Cagliari recorded what they called anomalous auditory standing waves in several tombs. When tones between 95 Hz and 120 Hz were introduced, usually human vocal hums, the interior chambers responded with unusual resonance. Not simple echo, not chamber amplification, but sustained vibratory feedback. One tomb, in the Oscuri region, emitted harmonic pulses long after the source had stopped. The sound rolled back and forth through the stone, like breath between lungs. That same year, a local historian named Silvano Ruggieri noted that several tombs were aligned, not just to celestial bodies, but to acoustic lines, connecting distant hills where stone chambers shared similar tonal properties. He proposed a theory that the tombs were part of a sonic network, a ritual landscape not designed to honour the dead, but to preserve something else. Not burial, he wrote, but broadcast. The bodies did not lie here for mourning, they carried the frequency. This idea, radical at the time, has gained quiet support, because the so-called giants of Sardinia may not be mythological at all. In 2002, an unverified photo surfaced in a local archive showing two excavation workers standing beside a recovered skull. The skull was elongated, massively so, with an extended cranium, shallow facial angle, and oversized ocular cavities. The official record listed the find as distorted from soil pressure, but the original notes from the lead anthropologist, discovered later in a misfiled drawer, told a different story. He wrote, "This is not deformation. This is design. The skull is built for sound." He was never heard from again in the academic world. That same year, villagers in Sant'Andrea Priu, where a tomb site sits quietly in the cliffs, reported a strange event. At sunrise, a local shepherd noticed his sheep frozen, all facing the same direction. No noise, no motion, just stillness. He followed their gaze toward the tomb entrance. From the shadows, a wind emerged. Not strong, but directed. As it passed over the tomb's lip, it created a pitch, a soft, almost imperceptible chord that rose and held. That shepherd didn't speak for 3 days. When he did, he told the village priest, "It was not a song, it was a question." This phrase has become the heart of the modern Sardinian mystery. What were the tombs asking? And more hauntingly, to whom? Linguists revisiting old myths found that many of the island's older dialects refer to the tombs not as houses of the dead, but as beds of the great listeners. In one fragment of a 14th century pastoral hymn, a verse describes the sunrise waking the watchers below, and their bones remembering the shape of the question they once asked the sky. We have assumed for centuries that tombs were for remembrance, for legacy. But what if these were built not to remember, but to store something that must never again be spoken aloud? Not history, but resonance. Not narrative, but intention. Because the deeper studies of the tombs reveal something unnerving. The resonance frequencies match those found beneath Mount Ararat, under Derinkuyu and in Malta's Hypogeum. Always within the same band, always near 110 Hz, always activating altered states in those who stand in the centre of the tombs at certain times, sunrise, solstice or full moon, as if the earth itself is humming a recurring note across scattered lands, and these tombs, these beds, are receivers, not for noise, but for the return of something once quieted. There is one tomb near Codovecchio with a unique structure. Unlike the others, its central portal is cracked, not by time, but by force from within. No tools, no weathering, just a fracture in the exact centre, like pressure once pushed out of the sealed tomb and split it open. Beneath that crack, archaeologists found nothing. No bones, no urns, just a thin layer of ash, and beneath that, a spiral etched into the foundation stone. The same spiral. Always. Inward. Never ending. Never explaining itself. So the question shifts. Not, who were these giants? But, what did they carry in their breath that had to be laid into stone? What tone? What memory? What voice? And if Sardinia's long-faced dead once vibrated with a resonance not of language but of command, then perhaps the tombs were not places of death at all. Perhaps they were mute agreements, placed across the world to keep the wrong song from being heard again. But now we dig, we scan, we hum, we test vibrations, and the beds begin to answer, not with noise, but with recognition. Because the ones who carved these tombs did not leave behind a story. They left behind a question with only one rightful singer. The tombs were never meant to be opened. That much is clear. There is a finality to their shape, a sense of conclusion pressed into the stone itself, not the kind that signals death, but the kind that signals an agreement sealed so completely that even time treats it with caution. Yet across Sardinia, the seal has been broken again and again, not through force, but through curiosity, through excavation, through inquiry. and each time the silence is pierced, the island becomes quieter in return, as though the land is trying to remind us that some memories were not buried, they were restrained. In the early 2000s, an attempt was made to reconstruct the sonic qualities of the tombs using modern digital resonance mapping. The experiment was simple. Recreate the internal acoustics of the longest surviving tomb chamber using high-frequency sonar and playback modelling. What they found was not an echo profile, but a humanoid harmonic imprint, a soundscape that behaved like a voice chamber. It was as if the stone had been carved around the vibration of a particular throat designed not for speech but for projection. The sound that emerged from the simulation was unsettling. Not a word, not a note. A layered tone, low, wide, and full of memory. One technician described it as being inside someone else's thought, but without knowing if the thought was finished yet. The local Sardinian elders had no need for scientific language. They had always warned that when certain tombs were disturbed, dreams would come. The kind of dreams that do not fade upon waking. The kind that bleed into waking moments. Faces you've never seen looking back at you. Places you've never been but now recognise. One farmer reported standing outside his own barn and feeling a sudden pull toward the earth. Not fear, not confusion, just certainty that something beneath was expecting him. He never returned to the field. Years later, a researcher revisiting his property found a small, square pit filled in with rough stones. At its base, a fragment of carved limestone. Too smooth, too polished, too precise. Upon it, the spiral again, but this time, beside it, a second symbol. A narrow oval with 5 shallow grooves pressed in parallel through the middle. Not a glyph, not a script, a measure, like a key pressed into wax, a reminder of form. From that point forward, the researcher began wearing earplugs whenever entering the tombs, not because of sound, but because of what came just before sound arrived. The flicker in the corner of the eye, the shift in inner balance, the sense that another presence was also standing inside the chamber, humming from a direction that didn't exist. Later scans of several tomb sites revealed something no one expected. Beneath many of the oldest chambers lie secondary stone beds, deeper and older, oriented beneath the others, not beside. These secondary slabs are unmarked, they hold no artifacts, but each sits precisely within the resonance line of the chamber above, as though the sleepers in the lower level were meant to receive what passed through the body of the ones above. This discovery shifted everything. What if the tombs were not simply burial sites, but transmission devices? What if the bodies laid atop the upper stones were not the message, but the messengers? Their skulls elongated not from deformity, but design. Their crania shaped to capture frequencies, their chambers of bone tuned to filter and relay. Human vessels turned into organic instruments that could carry resonance downward, into the bedrock. And what lay beneath them? Those second slabs, those silent listeners, the ones who no longer had mouths, only memory, the long-faced dead, the agreement. Across the tombs this pattern repeats. Always a forecourt, always an entry point aligned with sunrise, always a narrow passage leading inward, and always a chamber of reverberation. The design is not funerary, it is acoustic, it is ritual without metaphor, not for ceremony, for containment. Which makes the stories told by Sardinian elders all the more unsettling. Not stories of gods, not of monsters, but of teachers who were buried to protect the lesson. One tale from the village of Alghero speaks of the last tall man who knew the spiral by name. He lived in a hut outside the stone fields, never spoke, and was said to hum at dusk. Birds avoided him. He placed pebbles in long lines across his roof. One day he vanished. In his hut no books, no food, only a carved slab with 5 grooves and a phrase written in charcoal. I dreamed in a voice that wasn't mine, and it remembered me. If the tombs still hold something, it is not a danger in the way we understand it. It is not wrath, not poison. It is a pattern, one that once entered the world and was too perfect to remain. The people who built the tombs must have known that the danger was not in the beings themselves, but in what they carried. A frequency, a resonance, a language too complete, too able to bypass fear, logic, resistance. A voice that once heard could not be unheard, so they laid them down in stone, not as prisoners, but as safeguards, trusted with the silence, buried in structures shaped to hold the last breath before remembering. Stone beds placed not in death, but in delay. But sound travels, even when forgotten, even when covered by centuries of dust and soil. And today, as vibrations from cities, cell towers and underground cables reach farther than ever before, the stones are shifting again, not from force, but from alignment. We're playing the forgotten song again, and the ones beneath the tombs, they're still shaped like instruments, still waiting for the last note that completes the question they once asked the sky. The final whisper did not come as thunder. It came as a vibration through the soles of a hiker's feet somewhere near the abandoned Nuragic ruins just outside Oleana. He did not hear it. He felt it. A rhythm too slow to be wind, too constant to be accidental. A pulsing beat, like the echo of a heart that had forgotten to die. At first he thought it was machinery beneath the soil, but there were no power lines here, no drills, no sensors, no tunnels, only stone and something underneath it, calling. 3 days later, that hiker was found sitting cross-legged near a collapsed dolmen, hands muddy, eyes wide, lips moving but forming no sound. When approached, he raised one finger and tapped the air 4 times, then stopped. When asked what he saw, he simply wrote. It was not a voice. It was a memory trying to escape the body it forgot it once had. The archaeologist called it psychosomatic, stress, an overactive imagination coupled with the eeriness of the location. But they avoided the dolmen after that, not because of fear, because of recognition. Several reported having the same dream weeks later. A long hallway of stone curved at the top, flickering with a light that pulsed in time with their own breath. They were alone, but not. The tomb did not hold bodies in their dream. It held questions, and some questions should not be answered by the living. Beneath one of the newly unearthed chambers, one not previously documented, ground-penetrating radar picked up a pattern of concentric rings buried in the sediment, made not of stone, but of charred wood encased in hardened clay. A ring-shaped cradle beneath the tomb, perfectly aligned with the centre of the chamber above. This suggested something much older, or perhaps much more intended. Someone, some group, had placed this structure beneath the sleeping dead, as if to absorb something before it reached the deeper earth. Why would a tomb need insulation? Why would a burial structure be designed to prevent outward flow? The answer came from a legend known only to the mountain elders near Genagentu. It spoke of the ones who breathed backward, tall, still figures who did not inhale but exhaled constantly, filling the air around them with sounds that entered the minds of men and bent their intentions. It was said these beings once stood in the centre of gatherings, not as kings, not as priests, but as tuners, adjusting the moods of entire tribes through presence alone. But they grew too precise. Their harmony became influence, their influence became worship, and their worship became control, not through malice, but because no one could disagree with a voice that felt like home. When the Sardinian ancestors realized what had happened, they chose not to kill the ones who breathed backward. They could not, because to kill something that speaks with your own voice is to risk destroying your own mind. Instead, they built chambers of stone, layered with silence, capped with shapes that break the natural waveforms of speech. They laid the bodies down gently, bound not by rope, but by geometry, a kind of sacred math that even memory cannot escape. And above those tombs they scattered stories, misinformation, folk tales, ghosts and monsters, anything to keep the curious away. But memory is not linear. It loops, and today, with machines that recreate echoes, with microphones that capture frequencies older than language, we are picking up pieces we don't understand. A fragment of a sound buried in the walls of one tomb matched an underwater hum recorded miles off the coast, a frequency shared by no known biological organism, a humming song that lasted 6 seconds, repeating every 12 days, shifting slightly in pitch as if adjusting to something new. The tombs are not inert. They never were. They were part of a containment system, not to keep something dangerous inside, but to prevent resonance from spreading. A concept more dangerous than weapons, the idea that human thought could be tuned to ancient memory simply by standing in the right place, under the right echo, at the right time. It would explain the silence of the dead. It would explain the shape of their skulls, not as deformity, but as design. Not born that way, but made, shaped by stone beds and whispered harmonies to become human receivers of something not human at all. Not alien, not divine, just old. Older than writing, older than cities, older than forgetting. And the truth is, they were not buried in fear, they were laid down in trust. The tombs were not punishment, they were duty. These long-faced beings were not monsters, they were recorders, keepers of something too vast to be held in ink. So they held it in their breath, their bones, their silence. But time is a poor jailer, and noise is no longer rare. The machines that scan, the phones that ping, the drones that vibrate overhead, all of it shakes the stone now. And just like a note held too long on a forgotten string, the bodies beneath are beginning to respond, not by rising, but by remembering. And in those memories lie the patterns we are not meant to decode. Because once the last harmonic is triggered, Sardinia is only the first voice. There are tombs in Malta with similar shapes, carvings in Ethiopia with similar skulls, spiral markers in the Andes with the same 5 grooves, dolmens in Korea, long barrows in Britain, the same shapes, the same hum, as if the earth had agreed upon a design and scattered it like a signature across continents, a map not of land, but of resonance corridors, ancient paths through memory marked by stone guarded by the dead. And if we are now retracing them with satellites, sound mapping tools and infrared scans, we must ask, who are the tombs built to protect? The world? Or us? Or something still sleeping in between? The men who unearthed Göbekli Tepe thought they had discovered a temple. They were wrong. They had uncovered a memory device, a correction system, something that was never meant to rise again. Long before it became the world's oldest known ritual site, Göbekli Tepe had already been sealed. Not toppled, not ruined, buried by its own builders, layer by careful layer, stone by sacrificial stone, as if the very structure had become too dangerous to remain visible. Not because of what it contained, but because of what it reflected. Every pillar was carved with animals, but not as idols. They were warnings, sentinels. A stone bestiary meant not to glorify nature, but to document something far more intimate, the breakdown of order in the human mind. The foxes were not foxes. The vultures were not vultures. Each creature had a placement, a spacing, a repetition pattern that matched constellations only visible 12,000 years ago. To stand inside Göbekli Tepe was to stand within a sky made of memory, a sky that had once gone mad, and from that madness came language. Not the kind we speak with words, but the one shaped by resonance, echoing through the air like it once had in the stone tombs of Sardinia. The pillars were not monuments. They were tuning forks, fixed at specific intervals, some vibrating at frequencies still measurable today. The entire complex was a kind of circuit, unfinished, deliberately interrupted before its design could complete. Because what it was trying to do was not build a shrine to gods, it was trying to speak to something below them. That's why the Sardinian skulls matter. Their shape, elongated, tuned, sharpened, was not isolated. Within a cache found on the edge of the Tepe complex, human remains with similarly unnatural skull extensions were discovered. But not from birth. These were surgically altered, their cranial plates bound and formed over decades to elongate reception potential. These were engineered minds, not merely spiritual believers. They were not only priests, they were conductors. The long-faced dead of Sardinia may have once walked among the shrines of Anatolia. The same beings that were laid in silent tombs were first tuned here, and something in that process fractured. Göbekli Tepe began with harmony. Carvings depict careful hands, animals lying peacefully beside humans, serpents curled not as threats but as loops. Yet as construction moved outward, into later circles, something dark crept in. The beast twisted, the humans vanished, the serpents rose upright, no longer loops, but spears. In the outermost rings, unfinished stones lie broken, as if work was halted mid-command. One corner pillar still bears the grooves of an abandoned carving, as if the sculptor had left mid-strike and never returned. What interrupted them? And why was the site not just left, but buried by human hands meticulously, as if to hide not from an enemy, but from the echo of what had been attempted? One theory rarely spoken aloud suggests this. Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of civilization. It was the end of something older. a sanctuary not of worship but of containment, a reset switch. When the tombs of Sardinia began to echo back unintended memories, when the long-faced ones could no longer distinguish between their own thoughts and the resonance being pulled from the deep, the builders panicked. They didn't just stop the rituals, they tried to erase the code. But how do you erase stone? You bury it, like memory, like sin, yet stones remember. And the earth is never fully silent. Today, when ground sonar scans Göbekli Tepe, it reveals layers we've yet to reach. Not just more pillars, corridors, chambers beneath the visible circles, leading inward toward a core we cannot yet touch. Not because it's unreachable, but because those who uncover it begin to behave strangely. 2 workers went missing during a pre-dawn shift. When found, they were sitting inside one of the inner rings, their flashlights drained, hands pressed against the same stone, whispering phrases no one could understand. Their language had shifted. It resembled no modern dialect. But when compared to carved symbols on the oldest stones in Tepe's centre, a pattern emerged. They had spoken in mirror glyphs, symbols that only make sense when viewed upside down and reversed, as if the shrine itself had taught them a language not meant to be spoken aloud. And this is where the story bleeds back into Sardinia, because one of the few surviving songs of the Nuragic elders, sung in a language even they admitted was older than their memory, contains the same mirrored symbols when transcribed into notation, the same loops, the same breaks, the same intentional silences between phrases. Sardinia was not just a burial site, it was a receiver, and Göbekli Tepe, it was the transmitter, what was sent, and more urgently, has it ever stopped? That's where our next step leads us, not into Anatolia and not back to Sardinia, but across the sea to the walls of Baalbek. Because if Göbekli Tepe buried the signal and Sardinia tried to forget it, then Baalbek may be where the giants first tried to answer. The stones of Baalbek do not ask to be seen, they demand it. Unlike the carefully buried rings of Göbekli Tepe, the platform of Baalbek was never meant to hide. It was meant to endure. Set upon a high hill in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, the massive foundation blocks, some weighing more than 1,000 tons, sit like arrested thunder. They are not carved. They are commanded into shape, each one larger than what most modern cranes could lift, each placement more precise than any medieval fortress, and yet their builders remain nameless. The Romans came and built on top, but they never dared move the base. Even they seemed to understand. Whatever laid these stones was not a civilization, it was a warning. And the warning was not for mankind, it was about them. Baalbek is spoken of in hushed tones by local shepherds. They say that long before the temples of Jupiter and Bacchus, the site was called the landing place, not for birds, but for something heavier. In older erased texts, its name is whispered as Bethel, the house of God, and even further back as Baalat. Not a place of divinity, but of descent, where watchers once stood, where a gate to the heavens was held open long enough for rebellion to crawl through. And when that rebellion fell silent, only the stones remained, silent, heavy, immovable, or so it seemed. When studied closely, the trilithon stones of Baalbek show microfractures inconsistent with natural quarrying. They shimmer in certain lights, not like polished marble, but like struck bone, as if they had once carried immense frequency. They do not sing, but they do hum, that same low, inaudible vibration that once echoed in Sardinian skull tombs, the same resonance that once passed through the tuning pillars of Göbekli Tepe. And yet, unlike those places, Baalbek never turned quiet, because something in Baalbek kept listening, and then it started speaking back. In 1951, a set of archaeological scans conducted beneath the lowest stone tier revealed chambers, too regular to be natural, too deep to reach without destroying the site. Inside one borehole, a copper instrument was found, curved like a sickle, but with no cutting edge. Its handle was etched with crescent symbols matching those on the fox pillars of Göbekli. But there's one chilling difference. This tool was made to vibrate. It responded to low-frequency hums, amplifying their intensity. The same sounds that once filled the temples of Anatolia now echoed beneath the shadow of the trilithon. But who brought this instrument here? The answer, as strange as it sounds, might lie not in Lebanon, but in India, in the forgotten hill caves of Ellora. But before we leap across continents, the question must be faced. If Baalbek continued what Göbekli Tepe buried, and if Sardinia was once caught between them, used as an antenna of sorts, then who were these architects? Who built for the giants? Were they humans serving titanic lords? Or were they hybrids themselves? Elongated skulls, humming bones, their tongues tuned to the frequencies of the deep. There's an account faintly preserved in a lost Phoenician fragment describing men of strange gait arriving from the east, bringing stone-cutting tools that glowed like fire but left no heat. These men did not speak, they sang, and wherever they sang, earth became soft and stones aligned themselves. The locals feared them, calling them sons of Dagon, servants of a sleeping ocean god whose dream shaped rock. But one day, these stone singers vanished. Not fled, not killed, taken underground, down a shaft so deep the shepherds never returned, down where the resonance leads, and that shaft was beneath Baalbek. Göbekli Tepe tried to silence the signal. Baalbek amplified it. One buried the echo, the other carved its body into the world, and that body was never meant to move. Yet during the Lebanese Civil War, satellite scans of Baalbek captured a moment most dismissed as glitch. At 3:11 a.m., under a full moon, the central Trelathon platform vibrated, ever so slightly, by 1.4 centimetres. Too much for mere seismic activity, too little for a landslide. But exactly the margin needed to activate a sonic corridor, as discovered in an unpublished report suppressed in 1992. That vibration, measured across stone, air and underground water, created a frequency triangle pointing southeast, to a site in India, to Ellora. But before we leap, we must ask, did these builders migrate, or did they already exist everywhere? Was there a network of watchers and builders, each one tuned to the sky and the stone? Were the long skulls of Sardinia and the fox worshippers of Göbekli part of the same echo? Or, worse, were they all trying to stop it from spreading? What if Baalbek was the site that ignored the warnings? What if it chose to answer the signal and not bury it? And what, then, awaits beneath Ellora? In the quiet dark where the desert ends and rock begins to dream, the caves of Ellora hum with a silence too ancient to name. Carved not built, hollowed not constructed, the temples of Ellora were not shaped as much as excavated with purpose. Somewhere between a miracle and a whisper, entire mountains were peeled away, not from the top, but from within. Kailasa Temple, the crown of this subterranean monument, defies logic. Sculpted from a single rock, it is the world's largest monolithic structure. No scaffolding, no mortar, no seams, just subtraction, as if the architects already saw what was inside and simply freed it from stone. But this wasn't mere architecture, it was exorcism. When Baalbek vibrated that night under the moon's gaze, the frequency mapped directly to Ellora. Not in straight line, but in resonant code, echoes bouncing through fault lines and aquifers, riding the bone-deep channels left by forgotten waters. Ellora is not a temple complex. It is a capstone, a lid, a final seal. Because beneath the carvings of elephants and deities, beneath the swirling geometry of gods long forgotten, lies a cavity. Not one made by men, but revealed to them. A chamber untouched by sculptor's hand. A place even the monks dared not enter. Inside this void, the resonance of Baalbek finds no echo. It is absorbed, as if the stone here drinks vibration the way roots drink water. And what it drinks, it remembers. In 1864, a colonial geologist named R.L. Bartlett conducted unauthorized resonance experiments within the Ellora's lowest chambers. By striking bronze rods tuned to different harmonic frequencies, he hoped to detect mineral densities. What he discovered instead was displacement, not of rock, but of sound. At precisely 111 Hz, the tone vanished. No reflection, no vibration, no return. It simply disappeared into the floor. 3 days later, Bartlett disappeared too. His journal, however, was found wedged into the crack of a sandstone niche. Pages soaked in blood and rain. The last legible sentence read, "It was not echo I heard." It was breath. Ellora's cave system does not end where the maps say it does. Just past Cave 32, there is a sealed tunnel, choked with collapsed rubble. But 19th century records show it once opened into a chamber called Patal Mandir, or Temple of the Nether. An ancient inscription found near the entrance reads, "Beneath the world lies the first voice. It is not to be spoken to, it is to be buried." The locals never reopened it. They say gods once slept below, not peacefully, not willingly. The same symbols appear in Baalbek, on the underside of the trilithon blocks, and once again in Göbekli Tepe, on the necks of the headless fox statues. All across the world, the same script. Warning, half mathematical, half musical. The code of those who carved to silence, who tuned mountains into tombs, who buried not bodies but frequencies. Because if sound can build, it can also awaken. Elora's silence is not the absence of sound. It is a wall against it. But the wall is failing. In 2013, a group of amateur speleologists conducted a LiDAR scan near the sealed Patal chamber. What they found was not just a hollow beneath the temple. It was a vast descending spiral, extending hundreds of meters below recorded bedrock. More than a tunnel, it resembled a drain. And at its base, though the signal was faint, they recorded something pulsing. Like Göbekli's buried chambers, like Baalbek's trilithon hum, but different. This wasn't an echo, it was heartbeat. One not measured in flesh and blood, but in magnetic vibration. And it matched something else, a signal, from Antarctica. An icy continent that has no temples, no tombs, just ice, wind, and silence. And yet, buried beneath the frozen crust, there are structures, ancient geometric patterns visible only from high-altitude thermal scans. Perfectly aligned hexagonal formations, unnatural ridges, sharp corners, all beneath miles of glacial cover. And in one of those ridges lies an anomaly, an object that responds to the same 111 Hz frequency found at Elora. When researchers played the tone during an expedition, the ice beneath them cracked, not from heat, from resonance. What did Bartlett mean by, "It was not echo I heard"? It was breath. Could the underground chambers of Elora, Baalbek, Göbekli and Sardinia all be part of one global mechanism, not to preserve history, but to prevent it from waking up? What if the builders weren't worshippers or architects at all? What if they were prisoners, left behind not to rule, but to watch the locks? And what if the giants didn't die, but simply went quiet, deep beneath the places no man was meant to reach, until vibration finds them again? Because sound, once lost, can always return, and now it has.